A single $5 fine sparked a nightmare when Brad Hensley and his self-styled HOA cops stormed my home, turning my sanctuary into a stage for intimidation. Brad, a failed cop obsessed with control, reveled in petty tyranny, making a simple trash bin violation feel like a criminal offense. But when my son Luke, a Special Forces soldier, stepped in with calm authority, the balance of power shifted in an instant. Just wait to see how Luke's decisive actions brought justice, exposed years of HOA corruption, and restored peace to our neighborhood. It began with something so small, so absurd that at first I almost didn't take it seriously. A single sheet of paper, taped crookedly to my front door, fluttered in the evening breeze when I came home from grocery shopping. In bold black letters it read, "Immediate fine, $5 unpaid balance. Comply or face enforcement." I stared at it, blinking, thinking I must be reading it wrong. $5? Not 50, not 500, just 5. The price of a fast food meal, the kind of money you lose in the laundry and forget about. I couldn't help but laugh. Who in their right mind would issue an enforcement notice over something so petty? I crumpled the paper in my hand, shook my head, and muttered to myself that it had to be a mistake. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Not here, not in this neighborhood. Our subdivision in Georgia had fallen under the heavy hand of a homeowners association that had long since abandoned the idea of community. What it had become instead was a playground for a handful of people who craved power but had nowhere else to get it. They weren't real officers, but they acted like they were. They called themselves the Compliance Committee, though everyone in town knew that phrase was just a fancy way of saying Brad and his buddies making trouble again. Brad Hensley was the ringleader. Once upon a time, he'd tried to join the local police academy, but from what I'd heard, he hadn't made it past the first round. Instead of moving on with his life, he seemed to carry that failure like a chip on his shoulder. He strutted through the neighborhood with a radio clipped to his belt, a flashlight strapped to his vest, and, most laughably of all, a shiny badge that looked like it came from a toy store. But while it might have looked silly to outsiders, to those of us who lived under the HOA, Brad's antics weren't funny. He treated every late payment, every missed lawn trimming, every trash bin left out an extra hour as if it were a criminal offense. He had written neighbors up for kids' bicycles leaning against garage doors. He had issued fines for mailboxes with paint that had faded in the sun, and now apparently I was his next target. I paid my dues, always had, the HOA fees, the little maintenance costs, all of it. I didn't argue because I wanted peace. I wanted my home to feel like a sanctuary, not a battlefield. But according to the notice, I had failed to comply with a $5 fine from months earlier. A so-called trash bin violation. Apparently one Tuesday my garbage can had been visible from the street for longer than their approved time frame. $5, they claimed. $5 I had supposedly ignored. When I ran into Brad the next afternoon near the clubhouse, I waved the crumpled notice at him and asked as calmly as I could if this was some sort of clerical error. He leaned against his golf cart, arms crossed, that fake badge glinting in the sun, and gave me a look I'll never forget. "It's no mistake," he said flatly. "You ignored a compliance citation. Now it's an enforcement matter." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him this was ridiculous, that nobody should be harassed over $5, especially when I'd never even seen the original citation he was talking about. That's when he smirked, tilting his head like he had the upper hand. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll handle it our way." Something about the way he said it, low, smug, with that faint threat humming underneath the words, made my stomach turn. He wasn't talking about a simple late fee anymore. He wanted control. He wanted to make an example out of me. I walked home, the crumpled notice burning in my pocket, and for the first time, I felt it, the spark of anger. Not the fleeting frustration you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic, but the deeper kind. The kind that sits in your chest, hot and heavy, telling you that something isn't right. I didn't know exactly what Brad had in mind when he promised to handle it, but I knew one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. 2 nights passed after that strange and unsettling encounter with Brad. I tried to shake it off. I brewed my evening tea, settled into the couch with a book, and told myself it was just HOA drama, nothing more. But sometimes your instincts whisper the truth before your mind is ready to hear it. It was just past 9 when the sound came. Heavy, deliberate thuds across my front porch. At first, I thought it might be a delivery left late in the evening. But these weren't the light steps of someone dropping off a package. They were the measured, stomping boots of people who intended to be heard. I set my cup down and froze. Before I could even rise, a deafening crack split through the night. The doorframe shuddered, and with a splintering groan, my front door crashed inward. The sound was so violent it sent shivers up my arms. My sanctuary, the one place I should have felt secure, had just been torn open like paper. And there they were. Brad Hensley in front, chest puffed, his face glowing with the twisted satisfaction of someone who finally had an audience. Behind him, 3 men in matching black polos stormed inside. The word security was stitched across their chests in big white letters, but there was nothing official about them. They carried themselves like actors in a poorly rehearsed play, pretending to be what they could never truly become. A flashlight beam cut across my face, blinding me as one of them barked out, "Compliance check! You ignored the HOA notice." My knees trembled. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely this couldn't be happening. My second was fear. I'm a retired teacher, not someone built for confrontation. I'd spent my life raising kids, correcting essays, and planting flowers in the spring. Never in my worst dreams did I imagine strangers kicking through my door over $5. I tried to speak, to ask them to stop, but my throat tightened. My heart raced so hard I could feel it pounding in my ears. I stepped back until my shoulders pressed into the wall, the familiar texture of my own wallpaper suddenly feeling foreign, hostile. The men spread out like they were sweeping a crime scene. Their flashlights darted across family photos, across the couch where I had been sitting, across the table where my tea still steamed. This wasn't a fine anymore. This was intimidation. And then there was Brad. He stood in the middle of my living room with that smirk I had come to dread, eyes glinting like he had finally trapped the mouse he had been chasing. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence, the swagger in his stance, spoke louder than any words. To him, this wasn't about money. It was about control, about proving that he could take what little authority the HOA had granted him and stretch it into something resembling real power. Furious tears pricked at my eyes. My hands shook, not with rage but with helplessness. My home, the place where I had celebrated birthdays, held holiday dinners, and read bedtime stories to my children, had been turned into a stage for Brad's performance. And I was the unwilling audience. For that brief moment, I felt powerless, truly powerless. My voice meant nothing. My dignity meant nothing. To them, I was just another name on a clipboard, another case to enforce. But what Brad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't truly alone. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked ever so slightly. My son, Luke, had returned home on leave earlier that evening. He hadn't announced himself when he arrived. He wanted to surprise me after I finished my tea. He was resting quietly in his old room when the storm hit our doorstep. Luke had been trained to move silently, to observe before acting. And now, as those intruders strutted around my living room, he remained still as a shadow at the top of the stairs, listening, watching. I didn't know it then, but the tide was about to turn. Because while Brad thought he was in control, he had unknowingly stepped into a house guarded by someone far more prepared than he could ever imagine. The tension in the living room had reached a peak I never thought possible. The cops, Brad Hensley and his 3 enforcers, had spread out, their movements aggressive and deliberate. They weren't just posturing anymore. They were making threats, rattling off statements about seizing property if I didn't pay immediately. Every word felt like it chipped away at my sense of security. The air was thick with intimidation, and my pulse pounded like a drum in my ears. I clutched the edge of the couch, staring at them, my heart a frantic metronome of fear and disbelief. How could this happen over $5? $5. My home, my safe space had turned into a stage for their self-appointed authority, and I was the unwilling actor in their cruel little performance. And then, almost as if the universe itself had decided to intervene, a voice cut through the chaos. Go. Calm, precise, unshakable. You've got 3 seconds to get out of my mother's house. I froze, my breath caught mid-inhale. All four intruders stopped in their tracks. Even Brad's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. I looked up toward the landing and saw him, Luke. He stood there like a statue, but unlike any statue I had ever seen, his presence radiated authority, control, and something I could only describe as quiet danger. This wasn't the teenage boy who used to play catch in the yard. This was a man who had served in special forces, trained to read situations instantly, to act decisively, to command respect without a single gesture of aggression. The intruders glanced at one another, a flicker of hesitation spreading through the group. Brad tried to recover, attempting his usual posturing. He puffed up his chest, tried to muster a laugh, and said, "This is HOA business, kid. Stay out of it." But it wasn't the same room anymore. The balance had shifted. Luke's eyes locked on Brad, steady and unwavering. Every step he took down the stairs was deliberate, measured, and heavy with intent. He didn't rush, he didn't yell, he didn't make threats. His authority was inherent, unspoken, yet undeniable. And somehow, in that moment, I understood. He was in control. A strange sensation began to wash over me. Hope. For the first time in hours, I felt the weight in my chest lift slightly, as though the walls themselves exhaled with relief. My home might have been breached, my dignity shaken, but Luke was here. And that changed everything. I watched as the intruders shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering under the weight of his gaze. Every move Luke made, a slow step, a subtle tilt of his head, a slight tightening of his jaw, reinforced the message that they were not in charge, not here, not ever. Brad opened his mouth again, trying to reclaim the situation. But even I could hear the hesitation in his voice. The confidence that had filled the room when he first kicked down the door was fading, replaced by something unfamiliar to him. Doubt. Luke's presence was more than protective. It was strategic. Every inch he moved, every pause he allowed was designed to assert dominance without ever needing to escalate. I felt my own panic receding, replaced by a cautious optimism. My son, trained to face far more dangerous situations, had arrived just in time to prevent a disaster over something so trivial. I realized in that heartbeat of clarity that hope is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's calm, steady, and unwavering. Sometimes it's standing at the top of the stairs, eyes locked on the people who threaten what you love most, and knowing with absolute certainty that they are powerless. For the first time since the notice appeared on my door, I believed we could face this, that we could survive this, that justice might still have a chance. And in that moment, as Luke's eyes never left Brad, I felt a flicker of something stronger than relief. I felt certainty. Because while fear had filled our home moments before, now hope had arrived. And it was unstoppable. Luke didn't hesitate. Every movement he made was precise, controlled, and deliberate. the kind of efficiency you only see in someone trained to handle extreme situations calmly. The moment he stepped off the top landing, the entire dynamic in the room shifted. The intruders had thought themselves in command. Now, in seconds, it became clear who truly was. He approached the nearest man, whose baton he took from him with a single swift motion, twisting it just enough to render it useless without a struggle. The man froze, bewildered, unable to reconcile what had just happened. Brad, who had been so full of arrogance minutes before, found himself face down on the carpet, gasping under the weight of Luke's firm boot. There was no cruelty in it, only authority. A clear, unspoken message that this house was no longer theirs to control. The remaining 2 security officers hesitated, their confidence faltering under Luke's unflinching gaze. It didn't take long for hesitation to turn into panic. They bolted, tripping over each other as they fled into the night, leaving the room in a stunned silence. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The chaos of moments before had vanished as if it had been swept away by an invisible hand. Luke leaned down toward Brad, close enough that his voice was only audible to him. There was a calm precision in his words that left no room for misinterpretation. "You ever step foot in this house again," he said, "I'll make sure real cops deal with you." Brad's smirk had vanished. All the arrogance and bravado he had carried with him crumbled in an instant. He had underestimated the quiet, unassuming strength of a son returning home to protect his family. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, called by a neighbor who had witnessed the commotion, Brad was already subdued, his threats impotent. The sheriff listened as Luke calmly recounted every detail, supported by the security camera footage I had installed months earlier, footage Brad had never considered. The evidence was irrefutable. What had seemed like petty harassment and overreach was exposed for what it truly was. Years of HOA corruption, intimidation, and systematic abuse of power. Within days, the HOA board had dissolved. Brad and his allies were stripped of authority, their reign of petty tyranny ended. Neighbors who had endured his overzealous enforcement for years began speaking openly, sharing stories of fines, threats, and harassment they had silently tolerated. Our community breathed as if a long-held weight had been lifted. The sense of injustice that had plagued our streets and homes began to dissipate, replaced with a cautious optimism. Standing beside Luke on the porch that night, watching the last of the intruders disappear down the quiet street, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. My door was broken, yes, but my dignity was intact. The fear that had gripped me hours earlier was replaced by a profound sense of relief. And more than relief, there was inspiration, a deep, resonant understanding of what courage and quiet strength could achieve. Justice hadn't come from a title or a badge. It hadn't come from rules or authority. It had come from family, from presence, from the willingness to stand when intimidation threatened to overpower reason. In that moment, I realized the power of vigilance, preparation, and the courage to defend what you love. Luke's calm, unwavering determination had restored not only our home, but also our sense of security and faith in fairness. Watching him, I knew that true strength doesn't always announce itself with a display of force. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and protective, the kind that arrives just when it is needed most, transforming fear into hope, chaos into order, and injustice into triumph. That night, as the porch light flickered and the neighborhood settled into a rare, serene silence, I felt the kind of inspiration that stays with you. The kind that tells you that even in the face of absurdity and intimidation, standing firm and having the right support can change everything. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't official. Sometimes it is as simple and as extraordinary as the strength of a family who refuses to be bullied.